I think there's also arguments that by those tensions between different interests, this is actually how systems actually complexify, right? So I think this is very valid to just say it's completely okay to have first-person perspective, but of course integrate the needs of others, right? Because there's exactly this interaction by which new information and, for example, institutions actually emerge.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Metamodern Meaning Podcast, where we explore meaning in metamodernity and the meaning of metamodernity. I'm talking today with Anna Riedl. Anna's a brilliant cognitive scientist and got her master's in cognitive science from the University of Vienna under the supervision of Johannes Jaeger. Anna came to my attention because she's done some really fascinating work and written some articles with John Vervaeke on relevance realization, and they've had some conversations. And actually, most recently, Anna is the newest member of the Sky Meadow Institute team, helping out with some research into meaning and relevance realization, things we'll be talking about in this conversation, but has really been doing some interesting stuff, extending, that line of theory around meaning making and relevance realization in cognitive science. So there's a lot that we have to talk about, and I'll set that up more in a minute. But first, thanks, Anna, so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is exciting. So yeah, I've been aware of your work for a bit, and we had a chance to connect, I don't know, a couple weeks ago now, and just a lot of overlap with the kind of things that we're working on. You were gracious enough to read my book. I think you found that through the podcast I did with Jim Rutt, maybe. And
Yes.
yeah, and then reached out and we were talking a little bit about that. And basically, yeah, there's so much overlap between the stuff you're doing in cognitive science and some of which I touch on in the book. But there's also a lot of things in there that I don't touch on. And so I thought this would be a really great opportunity for you to bring some of that work into the conversation and educate me a little bit on, what things are also in the mix, because I would love for that particular work to be very robust in terms of the things that it's covering. So if not necessarily in the main body of the text, you can find things in the footnotes in the bibliography, as it were, that people can be directed to this really important line of research, which you yourself are helping to extend. So yeah, the first thought would just be that we can go a little bit through that and maybe use the book a little bit as a grounding thing, but you can share maybe some of your stuff, other things that you're familiar with, because this whole realm, again, of human meaning making and how that relates to the mind, how the mind realizes relevance, how the mind identifies meaningful information. This is all like really at the core of the work that fascinates me. So yeah, we'll get into that in a second. And then after that, I know you're doing some fascinating stuff around ethics and kind of autopoiesis. And there's some stuff that we can get into around there. But yeah, let's start with the whole relevance realization and meaning stuff. Wherever you'd like to, I guess. I mean, I can try to set us up a little bit there, but maybe if you want to throw out anything
I think I can start with just like some general context from my side, how
Yeah.
I ended up in a similar position as you did, because I think it's interesting because we probably started from different positions. And I came very, very strongly from the topic of rationality. So basically, I started before cognitive science, I studied psychology, but I also was involved with the effective altruism community, where it's also a lot about rational thinking. But I was really grappling with the question of rationality, which conceptually is very, very close to the question of intelligence. And well, on one hand, we have a lot of theoretical work there that I was grappling with, but of course it has a lot of practical implications as well. So rationality in a technical term usually means, well, what is true, which is epistemic rationality, right? Basically the question of epistemology, but also then what should you do? What are the right things to do, which is instrumental rationality. And of course, this is in the end a very practical question, right? So for example, if you apply to wanting to have an impact in the world, well, you have to know how this works. And classically, many people associate with it the question of overcoming biases and so forth. But in the end, I ended up with very different ideas. And also overall, the literature has very much evolved in recent years. So very much convergence to topics of autopoethics, not autopoetics, but autopoiesis, living systems, which you can see in the work by Carl Friston and so forth. But also active inference, so first-person perspective taken seriously, and then very importantly, the whole 4E cognitive science approach that became very more important in recent years. And of course, converging also on the problem of meaning, which is I basically wrote about rationality and ended up also thinking that the problem of meaning is the most important question that it points towards.
Yeah, and like the way that I kind of come at this in my own brief kind of presentation in the book where I'm drawing on John Vervaeke's work is I've heard him kind of introduce this issue through the so-called frame problem, right? Which is
Yes.
like in terms of all the information that can be sort of taken into account hypothetically,
Yeah.
what do you zero in on? What is actually relevant in a given kind of frame context?
Yeah.
And trying to compute that algorithmically actually turns out to be rather difficult. And so then that gets right to the heart of like, how do we think of relevance and meaning in those kinds of terms, in ways that you could actually think of algorithmically, computably, and what sort of deeper processes are actually governing that kind of decision-making process. The way I'm going about this, which is sort of, it seems like, I don't know, fairly common now in this field to explore it through these particular lenses, is something like meaning is that particular subset of kind of information linking an entity to its context that bears directly in a causal way on its sort of viability. That's sort of the basic notion. And so for me, that's a very powerful framing because then it allows you to look at that process, that dynamic at multiple scales. And so that's what I try to do, begin to set up in this book series about the evolution of meaning, because you can look at that process at the matter level, at the life level, at the mind level, at the culture level, across cosmic evolution, and you can see that entities and contexts are basically what cosmic evolution has produced, and so there's meaning making going on at all these different levels of cosmic evolution, including at the culture level, which is where then my work mostly focuses on this. And I'm really interested in sort of how cultural meaning systems have evolved and can be viewed through this lens. But to get that deeper understanding, you've got to get the deeper mechanics and the architecture of what's going on here. So you named a couple of frameworks that are doing that, the active inference folks and the free energy principle, Carl Friston's work, again, John Vervaeke's work trying to get at this. And it's such a rich and important field. And then particularly right now with AI stuff where like, trying to think about how artificial intelligence is or is not, engaged in meaningful information processing. So there's so many areas that this touches on, but and also it's such a rich topic, so it's
Yeah.
difficult to kind of find a way in. There are multiple angles we could, or points we could touch on. I am
Yeah.
curious though about like the work that you're doing. Maybe we could start with that, like
Yeah.
or wherever you'd like to. I mean, that might require also some setup to kind of discuss what has
Yeah.
come. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I actually have one great point that really right like fits very very importantly. So because I was grappling with this question of rationality, right, where the underlying idea is, well, right, we can apply decision theory and so forth to basically calculate what the right thing to do is, at least in right like situations like playing poker or whatever. You can calculate what is optimal. But it also has this idea of a very very strong focus on propositional, like the importance of truth, right? Having true beliefs about the environment, basically as objective as possible from a view from nowhere. And the more I was grappling with this, how right, like the question of true beliefs fit together with instrumental rationality, right, like doing the right things. The more you notice, oh, there is actually the relationship between the two questions is interesting because, of course, the search for information at some point also becomes part of the utility calculus, right? Which information should I seek out? There is a value of information, and in a sense, the questions collapse into one another, right? Which is exactly the question of what information is meaningful, which relation has relevance or significance. So for me, they're basically all the same terms, because you cannot right, like you because you're not in this platonic um, whatever space idealized world. Uh, you um, you have to, in a real world, consider which information you seek out that will then make a difference, right? That's exactly what information means. It makes a difference to how you act. And this means there's only so much information that is meaningful to you. And therefore, in the end, the question of information collapses into this notion of valuable information, therefore, like what is meaningful to an organism.
Yeah, and I think that whole reframing around this not being a view from nowhere, right? It's
Yeah,
exactly that embeddedness of the entity in context that makes all information processing perspectival. There is no just blanket information in the abstract, as it were. I mean, one
Yeah.
can conceive of that, but ultimately one is an observer thinking mind, doing that kind of thing from a particular stance still. So there's once you kind of make all this perspectival, then it ceases being this sort of like, yeah, God's eye view or view from nowhere computational challenge of trying to think about this in some abstract way. And it actually situates every kind of decision-making process in a context so that all of that processing is then happening for a processor, for a mind, for an intelligent agent, and that kind of contextualization seems ultimately key. And John talks about that transjectivity being
Yes.
that framing. For me, connecting that to issues of like metamodernism, I think it's also really key because that initial move to like radically situate the knower initially kind of creates this sort of relativism of like, oh well, I guess if there is no God's eye view, then it's all relative. But that's not quite right, right? I mean, like there is a real relationship then between every knowing or learning agent and their environment in such a way that, if they don't adequately navigate their environment, then that's going to have existential consequences for them. So
Yes.
this transjectivity of meaningful information then is kind of it gets us past that kind of relativistic assumption. It actually says that yes, it's relative, but it's relative always to something, to some reality and experience or context, and that itself is kind of a real basis then for meaning. That to me is just an important kind of philosophical outgrowth from all of this, and a way of kind of moving past a lot of the postmodern value nihilism and value relativism. So just to
Yeah.
also kind of foreground that. And so, yeah, so that's again, a good kind of setup for all this. I'm curious, like, so I think there's a lot of shared framing in this, with your work, with John's work, with my work and others. Where are you seeing sort of the kind of leading edge of this new line of thought? And also like, who are some particular folks playing in this field who have helped move this ball forward? I don't know, because again, you're much more deeply versed in the literature. So I'm curious, like,
Mm.
what's been coming out, say, in the past 10, 15, 20 years, where this seems to be like an emerging paradigm. I'd be curious, thinkers that you would name in that space. Again, like
Mhm.
people that I should be referencing in this book, and
Yeah.
also the stuff that you see as really kind of moving this forward.
Let's start with the rationality landscape. So I already said I was grappling with the standard approach there, which is very powerful. So the standard approach, where then also behavioral economics stemmed from and so forth, is the axiomatic approach, where you abstract from a situation an idealized world in which then very simple axioms of rationality apply, right? So transitivity and so forth. There's some like a very linear valuation of value, because there's a lot of context that is always right. Some things are always better. There's no like quick shift from one situation to the next. And then we have axioms of rationality by which you can, for example, measure how rational an agent behaves in this small world abstraction. And this is exactly where the whole behavioral economics came in to show this. Oh, humans are less rational than in these models, and such formal worlds make the extremely complex real world very tractable, right? Because there's lots of parts of the world that you can treat well by ignoring a lot of other stuff. Basically, you always have to do this, right? Whenever you want to fix one small part, you have to narrow in, and then you can idealize them, and then you can also accordingly formalize it and very strictly think through every step that is allowed in this world. So this is like the axiomatic approach. And all the behavioral economics basically built on these models and the deviation to these models. And then on the other hand, there was the ecological approach to rationality that emphasized the adaptability to the environment more than the conformity to those axioms. And in recent years, I would say, especially the people on the ecological rationality side, they really showed they developed further into the direction of for example, semiotics. So there is a paper by Kozirova and Hertwig, if I remember correctly, about the interpretation of uncertainty in ecological rationality. And there they also came to exactly this problem that the uncertainty cannot be understood as a property of the environment, but it has to be understood as a property of the agent environment system. And but they cite all the same people as you also cite, like von Uexküll, and so forth, that there's this Umwelt and this subjective meaning world, and uncertainty has to also be understood as semiotic.
And just real quick, is that would like Gibson fall in that, like his affordances theory and all that? Is he in that camp, or am I mixing him in with a different?
I mean, they're hinting in that direction.
Yeah.
I am not sure whether they explicitly cite Gibson, but it's very closely related
Okay.
to this semiotic understanding of the environment. So I would say there is some development into the same direction from the ecological rationality perspective. Then between the axiomatic and the ecological perspective, there's my work with John, but also many other people in there, where what we say is that both approaches, of course, matter, right? Exactly this problem of relevance realization. Because the world is untractable and complex, we have to make sense out of the world. We have to have an insight in which small idealization right now makes the world tractable, right? What is the meaning of the situation right now? So, right, my meaning or my situation is going on right now is, okay, I'm having a conversation with you, but the relevance of the situation would change very quickly if someone would run in and try to stab me, right? And if I would focus on this part and think this is the main thing that matters, then I would not reach my goal of which are multiple, right? So we show basically this tension that, of course, you need to be adaptable and responsive to your context, but you also can use abstractions in which you then can do very good approximations of what the best behavior is. So for example, again, if I want to play poker, it's very good to understand game theory. Basically, I have to understand these optimal theories to do the best in this small world, right? And this applies to many parts of the world where being able to abstract, making sense of the world, to create a small world idealization helps me to then get an optimal grip on situations where I can ignore context that's not relevant right now, right? It's this ongoing process of this non-dual awareness of what's beyond what I'm currently seeing as relevant, right? This bottom up and this top down of what are my goals and what is important right now. This is this relational or dynamical process that's going on. So our theory basically fits in between the axiomatic and the ecological, where we say, of course, right, a lot of things have to be adaptive to the environment. But it doesn't negate the importance of the axiomatic approach, which can be a super important tool. But we need formalisms to treat many things well. They were some of the most important tools that we also as a culture develop. Right, it is an important cultural tool. So but for this we have to actively create and bring forth the small world idealization and exactly realize when it is relevant. Right, so we fit in between there.
So does that mean something like it's sort of we are always kind of navigating kind of a map or a landscape, and as we're attending to things of relevance to us, we kind of we have a kind of attentional focus that makes a small world out of a particular situation. Like right now, you're attending to this podcast that we're doing, right? So that's your axiomatic set of, small world conditions. Yeah. But if someone barges through that door with a knife, all of a sudden you kind of have to shift, your framework and your small world relevance realization, set of kind of axiomatic terms to orient now to this other thing. So it's like, it's like, yeah, it's a fascinating kind of synthesis then of these different, very kind of formal abstract approaches, and then the very kind of, relative ecological ways of thinking. And it kind of brings them together as though there's some kind of continual toggling, I guess you could say, that we're doing between different frames. Is it something like that?
Yeah, for sure. Right, you have to try out different explanations so you can switch between them, this active open-mindedness, also to even create the question, options to choose from through which lens to look through. I also think just learning theories or concepts can be very powerful. For example, for exactly this cultural evolution, where I can then use, which you also talk about, right? I can use symbolic representations that others have created to then apply them to my own reality. And what I also find very important to mention here is because right now, both examples, right now I'm talking to you, if someone came in, then this would be relevant, but both things would be directly in front of me, right? They were actually part of my objective environment in a sense, right? I'm directly there. But it's really important to, right, when we talk of the Umwelt, the meaning world, it can also be part of the very extended environment that I don't even see right now, right? So if my goal, let's say I have a company, right? I don't have to be in the office to sit at home and think about it and represent it right now. So even though I'm not actually physically there, I can of course be intentional about it, or represent the structure of maybe, I don't know, how people interact there, or the tasks that are there in my head, and simulate it and work with that abstraction as well. Which seems so obvious to say. It's yeah.
Well, no, I mean, it's really interesting to me because one of the things that this then brings up is like, it's not only adaptive and viability enhancing to adequately navigate those particular frames and those sort of axiomatic small worlds. It's also adaptive to know how they relate to each other, right? To know, and there seems to be like a meta frame required to even be able to relate these different kinds of frameworks in a bigger coherent system, right? Because the danger would be that in a sense existence just becomes a disjointed, incoherent set of different sort of action patterns that you step into to meet very specific situations. But there is also a broader level of coherence as these different, like they're attending maybe to different aspects of reality, but there is a continuity to that reality as well. So having kind of also multiple scales of frame to be able to relate these things also seems like an important thing. And that to me is a really fascinating idea, because that also then gets at, well, it gets at a number of things, both like meta theory and trying to bring in together like the coherent unification of different small perspectives or even theories or approaches. But it also, in my work, I talk about the sacred as being that sort of gesture to, or part of what it includes is sort of the gesture to the ultimate environment, which is kind of this frame of frames. It's like where all these things sit together. And so that also seems to be an interesting part of the relevance realization, set of concerns. So that's just some stuff that came up from me while you're talking about that.
Yeah. So, oh my God. So like, exactly. It's an extremely deeply, broadly branching tree of all the things to connect here right now. So I really hope we manage to have like a coherent structure in how we approach the topics. The point I wanted to make with also the environment, and that I can, right, like something can be relevant that's not directly around me, is because, so for example, in ecological rationality, the environment was understood as a kind of a if this environment, then this action, where there was a claim of basically objective features, pre-given features, that would then fit a heuristic that one should take. And they would also implicitly assume that you can then approach this with psychophysics, right? Because there are just basically objective features that then result in you having, well, certain heuristics that match that. And coming back to the question of which literature I really like or recommend reading. So one researcher I read a lot and who influenced me a lot is called Teppo, and he proposed the idea of generative rationality, where he exactly also includes topics that John also talks about, like salient landscapes. And in particular, he talks about this problem of, well, the pre-given world. And in a sense, he comes exactly to this inactive conclusion that it is a relational or a transjective meaning that you have to actively create. And the example he makes is, I think it's about the story of Sherlock Holmes, where in this one story, right, the important cue is an absence, right? Namely, the absence of, there is no dog barking. Therefore, we know the person must have been someone that is familiar to the affected family or whoever it was, right? So this cannot be treated as a pre-given cue-based understanding of reality, because it was the absence of the cue. So there must be this active inference of interpreting the meaning of what is going on. And he also applies this to questions of value creation, which again might be interesting to you, where, for example, when we look at the efficient market hypothesis, then right there you won't find a $100 bill laying on the ground because everyone can see it. But when we assume that we have to create meanings and to see certain things, then value is not obvious. So it's not given, and the obviousness is actively created. So there must also be a huge difference in which value you're even capable of seeing and to create, for example, as an entrepreneur, right? It's very specific to which person will see which opportunity. So it's exactly this agent arena relationship that is highly dependent on the agent, their personal history, their knowledge, and most importantly, really like this first person perspective. And the other paper he wrote was about the all-seeing eye in rationality, which comes back to this perception question of perception, right? That we think there's just this objective arena where everything comes pre-labeled, and now you just have to like do the right thing because you just kind of collect the truth and the information, and then you just do what's necessary or whatever. And he really criticized this view from nowhere, which is also very connected to this question of biases, where the best thing would be that you're not biased. But in a sense, a lot of biases are basically assumptions which you have to make because you have to value some things over others, right? So I think his work has strongly influenced me. And he, of course, he has written with Stuart Kaufman, right? So he also comes definitely from the complexity perspective himself.
Awesome. Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, as you say, there's so much here, and I don't want to. I'm tempted to lead us down all these tangents and bring, try to draw out some philosophical implications, but I also don't want to, interrupt the kind of more logical, coherent flow of these things. So, yeah, I mean, keep going. This is great, or unless you want to, try to parse any of the metaphysical implications or any of this, but
it's a long list of things or people worth mentioning. So one person I've recommended to you as well as a comment on your book, which I assume you've read or know, is David Chapman.
Yep.
Right. So meaningness, but also meta-rationality. So he like very strongly is in exactly the same area.
Yeah, I was just going to say, unpack that a little bit because I'm like familiar with his work, but I haven't really done a deep dive. So I know that there's a connection there, but say more about what he's doing.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I would be good at summarizing meaningness. Maybe, but so I think both meta-rationality and meaningness hint at similar things where, right? So in rationality, again, you can assume there's this like perfect, how should I say, this complete representation of the environment, and then you can take perfect decisions in it. Or you can say, oh, but like it doesn't work, and you sink into like complete relativism. There is no truth, whatever, right? Once you start taking the subjective experience seriously, and the same is in questions of meaning. It's kind of the same, right? Either you have absolute rules, absolute systems, or this complete relativism or nihilism. And in both ways, he argues for this middle path, which is strongly also influenced by Buddhism. And so I'll start with meta-rationality first. So, right, we are not in a casino. We cannot just calculate the probabilities of every possible action and then calculate what the right thing to do is. But those systems of formalization can be extremely useful, right? So it's good to be able to do this, whether you want to be an engineer, a poker player, or just solve any small problem where you can ignore the context basically by simulating through all the possibilities inside of it, right? So it is extremely good to be able to formalize problems, but it doesn't suffice, and you cannot formalize the whole world as one system. So you need this developmental stage, which you will probably also talk about, of being able to hold those formalizations in your head, but also fluidly switch between them to apply them where they are relevant, right? So this is what he coins as meta-rationality. And in a sense, I've built on very different literature, but I came to the same conclusions.
I just want to say that's really fascinating. So I haven't really, again, like deeply gone into his work, but that's so relevant, and to ways that I also talk about metamodernism itself is precisely that. It's sort of that meta contextual awareness of when certain frames are relevant to toggle into, and that there are different degrees of, you could say, context awareness that themselves need a broader context to be contextualized by to properly relate to. And so yeah, I will. I'm definitely check out. In fact, maybe he would be someone I should have on the podcast because that sounds
Yeah,
really
I
great.
think you absolutely should. And I would say my, how's it called, parasocial, like beginning as parasocial relationship with him and you are somewhat similar because right, like, I've seen you around online, I've seen him around, but in both cases, I kind of intentionally did not immediately engage, but really grapple with my own questions, and then later down the road, started to actually see what both of you have produced.
Mm,
And I think in both cases, it was reassuring because we very much converged, but also we very much built on different literature when solving similar questions.
yeah,
And this gives, of course, a robustness to the argument that would
yeah.
not have been if I like just had like read your book and be like, this kind of makes sense. And yeah, I found this very reassuring in both cases.
Quick question too is from being more again kind of inside the academic literature and certainly the cognitive science side of this stuff. Do you have a sense that this is like a paradigm that the researchers exploring these topics are sort of self-aware of the fact that we're all kind of pulling the same thread? And if so, like, is there a term or a name for that? Because I do just see all this convergence in a very similar direction. And what I'm always trying to do as well is like, kind of get a mirror of ourselves to ourselves. So we know that we're working together on something. So it's not just disconnected. It's like, oh yeah, there is something like a paradigmatic research program here unfolding. So I'd just be curious if you have a sense for that from where you've been coming from, apart from just obviously knowing these different, groups of literature yeah. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, some parts are definitely very much connected. I think one big hub is the whole Santa Fe Institute and
Mm,
complexity science more broadly. And then another hub is the 4E cognition
yep.
literature, which is also somewhat fragmented,
Mm,
right? Of course, but like in the end, people specialize a lot. So there's
yeah.
not many people that then do 4E, but often right like enactivism or embodiment or
Mm,
focus on embeddedness, but not necessarily 4E and committed to all of it. At least not explicitly, right? Because once you focus and specialize, that you no longer use the descriptive term so much. So I see a lot of fragmentation there, but I also see a lot of actual convergence in ideas, and often I think just many people don't see the connection or they don't know that other parts exist. And
hmm
this really goes far beyond what I've mentioned so far. Right? There's so many. But I mean, I have a long list of other people I could mention. But for example, in economics, right, there's also this question of radical uncertainty, and you had researchers like Mervyn King and John Kay who wrote about it, and there was also the center that they founded in the UK about exactly approaching radical uncertainty, right? Exactly this open-ended world where quantifying things easily is very hard. And it's that you need this semiotic approach. But there's, for example, David Tuckett, he's both a psychoanalyst and an economist.
Hmm.
And he and his collaborator, I think his name is Johnson, they argue also as micro narratives or narratives being the currency of thought,
Oh,
where
interesting.
yeah, exactly. So where they again also see right this David Tuckett calls it the creation of fantastic objects. Right? So for example, why does a bubble happen? Right, because people look for well, what is going on in the world, and then they have to, of course, make sense of the out of the world, which depends a lot of on their worldview, on their knowledge, on like smaller beliefs they hold, and then they have to look at things, and then they have to project from what's going on, and then of course, right, those ideas can spread. Other people can get convinced too, and well, something are genuine hypes, right? Not all bubbles or like jumping onto things like that is not all of it is irrational because narratives can actually help get a grip on the world, and but exactly you need this narrative framework where you make an interpretation of what is going on, and there are right David Tuckett is very much aware of, but he's so far away I
Huh.
don't think I don't think he knows David Chapman exists, right?
Interesting.
So
Yeah, well, it's so fascinating because what you're also pointing to, one is like this is a multidisciplinary kind of what would you say, kind of research program. Again, it's like
yeah,
there's a gestalt there, there's a general paradigm that people are
yeah,
pursuing with these similar structures to them, but economics, cognitive science, I come from a humanities and religious studies
Yeah.
background, and and then yeah, there's all of that. And yeah, to me, it just seems like it would be incredibly valuable if there could be a kind of self-awareness and self-consciousness of those continuities across these different disciplines, so that there could
Yeah.
be more overlap and cohesion there. And yeah, that's a fascinating prospect. What you were saying just a second ago made me think of something, and I also wanted to throw that in, but I think it.
Oh,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I have a great thing to say as a kind of a counter argument. So, like, of course, I'm super excited about what's happening. I'm optimistic that this will develop further in whatever way. But I think the pessimistic perspective would be this is not new at all.
Mm,
So,
mm,
right, like, so for example, that you need, right, that you cannot, for example, use certain statistical methods outside very specific contexts.
yeah.
But you're right, like that this is how it works. This is not new. Literally, the founder of Bayesian decision theory has
Uh-huh.
written in the
Yeah.
foundational book about this,
Mm,
but then everyone forgot it,
mm,
tried to apply it for everything, and now
yeah.
we're rediscovering
Huh.
what the limitations are, and that right that a lot of this is not the whole world is formalizable, but you need exactly this meaning making outside of it. So this is very much. I would say something that just comes up again and again. I also recently read a book on Clausewitz, who is this strategist that wrote on basically the philosophy of war strategy. And even he already, right, even
Hmm.
in these books, it already said you cannot calculate those things, and right, you need a comprehensive understanding of the situation. So I think, in a sense, these are all things that we just collectively forget
Yeah.
again and again, and then have to rediscover. I also found a book from the beginning of the 20th century about meaning that's very similar. But I think the interesting part here is actually, so I think the meta point that's interesting is, of course, we forget collectively, right? Because
Hmm.
we get born ignorant, and then we have to every generation has to
Hmm.
relearn what we have collectively already gathered, and the
Yeah.
default is always ignorance and forgetting, which is actually
Yeah.
this. But you have to generate the organization
But
over time.
that's very fascinating though, because I feel like there's also the capacity for a ratcheting effect where we don't have to lose so much. We could, if we properly institutionalize the key insights, then, it's like, for example, it's not like every generation of evolutionary biologists has to like, go through the Lamarckian thing again, right? It's like we've learned, oh, well, that doesn't quite work. And so there's
Yeah,
this. Now, actually, maybe that's not the greatest example because some of Lamarck's ideas have subsequently been found
yeah.
to actually be true. But I mean, basically, if we can do a good job of institutionalizing the knowledge frame again in a paradigm, then that helps with the kind of intergenerational transmission of like, no, this is the really important thing here. I think I agree with you. There is a lot of recouping and rediscovering things that are already there, but I think we could get better at preserving and encapsulating again that the meaningful enshrinement of information to carry forward, which is a big part of what I'm also trying to convey in terms of notions of the sacred and worldview and things. But were a couple things that I wanted to ask on that front too, though, because first an observation, which is that I've had a similar experience. Like I've been reading a lot of George Herbert Mead, and some earlier sociologists, and they're saying versions of all this too. That it's like the mind is framed by society and society by the mind, and this whole kind of dynamic feedback loops and transjective relationships that again these seminal thinkers got and understood, but in many ways we're having to go back and rediscover. Of course, emergence itself was an idea that goes back to the late 1900s and early 20th century. So anyway, many instances of that for sure, and probably we could find kernels of this going even further back than that. But one question I did want to ask real quick is also just like again, I'm not operating within the cognitive science frame, and so I'd be curious to get a handle on the degree to which this is even a paradigm or the paradigm, because like, are there, for example, scholars who are just doing kind of classic axiomatic computational, Platonic style approaches? Like, is that a
Yeah.
viable? Yeah, really? Okay, so
Yeah. Right. So actually, learning paradigms is very important for cognitive science. And right, one comes in is like, just teach me the one correct theory of how the mind works, and then you learn a lot of philosophy of science, where this is not possible. Here are different paradigms that prioritize different things, right? Which then results in completely different theories and perspectives on the same object. And then depending on what you want to study or which assumptions you make, different paradigms become important. And what I find very important to stress is that one paradigm is not necessarily better than another, because, for example, when you go very far back and you just have the logicist, right, where you really just apply logic to understand what the mind does, that makes it, of course, it's wrong, but every model is wrong in different ways, but it's very tractable, right? It results in a lot of answers to the questions you're asking. And then you have different paradigms like right, in psychology, we had behaviorism, and then came the cognitive revolution, where we understood, okay, we cannot just look at input, output, and black box models, but actually we have to make some assumptions of what is happening in the mind to understand what's going on. So there was this cognitive revolution, and in cognitive science, you had the whole cognitivism, which had precisely this notion of information processing, right? Mind is information processing, which, well, is very relevant to what you're saying. But how we conceptualize information is, of course, very, very important. And exactly because the information processing paradigm or cognitivism was built so strongly on this notion of basically the mind as a computer, that's exactly why later these other paradigms emerge, right? The whole 4E approach, where right, you see that this doesn't work in important ways, and there are further questions to ask.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, one, I want to start to move into some of these other topics that I wanted to explore with you, like the ethics things too. But there is so much here. Maybe we can begin to throw some of these last thoughts together around this, because this is really helpful for me, and like I'd love to just get kind of a select bibliography from you on some of these major aspects, because both for my own study, I'd like to dig deeper into these things. But again, also like things that I'm identifying, trying to get across as a basic point, there's scholars who have kind of, explored that particular aspect very deeply. And they're also, as we're talking about, kind of paradigmatically related to each other. So I want to kind of fold all that in as much as possible. And this is really helpful for that. Any maybe final thoughts on I'm
actually just looking at the email I sent you with comments. So I'm just actually making sure I mention everything that I've mentioned to you.
Sure.
Okay, so just to actually go through what I've recommended to you, that others can also maybe use those sources. So one person that I find extremely important to understand many of the problems of meaning is William Wimsatt, because he wrote the kind of to my mind, it's the most powerful philosophy of science book that's currently out there, and it's called Re-engineering Philosophy for Limited Beings. And he really clears up very foundational assumptions that are very important to even come to these conclusions. So one of those is the view from nowhere, right, the Laplacian demon, and that the right approach to philosophy of science is also that we kind of aspire to have this godlike perspective. And he says, well, that's not very useful, because that's just not the case. He makes way more eloquent arguments for the importance of this. And then another thing he argues is another assumption that's often implicitly made, and I made it as well, is the idea of the desert ontology, which is the extension of reductionism. So that you, in a sense, believe that smaller or lower organizational properties are more real than higher properties. So that you would feel, oh yeah, atoms are real, right? But then you and me, we're just kind of this epiphenomenon of what physics does. But he argues for, no, there are real organizational thickets that are real entities, right? And because of computational complexity, you cannot, because there are limits on what we can compute in information, you cannot fully reduce one thing to the other, because you just cannot fully just process the information of what's going on to create the next entity. And the argument here is this idea of this, in principle, we could calculate something. And he just throws this out and says, well, but it doesn't matter if you could do it in principle, because factually you cannot, right? And this, we live in the factual world and not in principle, because you just cannot actually calculate. Maybe this could change, but I think there's arguments that there are some fundamental limits to this.
When was this published?
I
Like, you
forgot
don't
the
have to,
exact year,
it
but
doesn't matter the exact
maybe
year, but
15 years ago or so.
yeah,
Maybe
okay, so yeah,
very recent actually, and
okay.
it builds on many of his on his like the individual works that all his graduate students did.
Hmm.
But I think just this book is yeah.
Yeah, that sounds excellent.
Yeah, that's and he was also a philosopher of biology, so
Hmm.
very inspired from biological systems. Exactly. The Tepophyllin I've mentioned, David Chapman I've mentioned. Then two other people that I think they were both actually at like John Vervaeke, they were both in at the University of Toronto.
Hmm.
One is Brian Cantwell Smith,
Yes,
and I think
okay.
he's oh yeah, you know him. He's
I've heard
I
of,
think
maybe actually through you, I'm not sure, but he's definitely on my
possible.
radar. Yeah.
Maybe from, do you know Jake Ortwine?
No.
Oh, wow. Okay. Fascinating. Wow,
Yeah.
there's so many connections that should be made.
That's why
Because
you're
Jake,
here.
yeah, because Jake recommended his work to me, and I think he has still not published it, but he's working on this multi-volume book series called The Age of Significance.
Wait, is he a younger guy?
No, I think he's very old.
Oh, okay, gotcha. All right. I was like, wait, maybe I
Jake
do
is
have him.
young, but no. Um, then the other person that's also at the University of Toronto is, of course, Jordan Peterson, who has where I actually recommend his papers because I think they just distill his opinions on the problem of meaning better than digging through the whole maps of meaning. And the papers are meaning of meaning, complexity management, blah blah blah, under uncertainty or complexity, and then three forms of meaning, which very in a sense, I would say it verbalizes something that's very similar to the whole active inference, free energy principle, but in a in an interface to make it more suitable to read as a psychological creature, right? As a normal human that doesn't want to read so much mathematics. Um, and then, well, okay, then another literature that I find extremely interesting is everything around the problem of insight.
Hmm.
Right? Because you talk about the problem of not the problem, but the process of complexification, and John and we also talk about the frame problem, and there's exactly this problem at this point where, well, you make sense out of information, the current order breaks down, and then it reintegrates into a higher like in a higher state of complexity, and this process is called insight. But there's outside of the people we know. Right, John talks about it. Brett Anderson writes about it together with John and Mark Miller. But there's also a huge other literature on the whole problem of insight, sense making, and perception under uncertainty. Among others, there's Gary Klein, who did the whole naturalistic decision making. Where what I find very interesting there is he doesn't only talk about, well, under uncertainty, sense making, but also that in collectives it's very important to continuously establish a common ground of sense making, so you can, for example, act as a team. And he helps very he's very applied. He actually helps just professionals to become better adapted to actually what they have to be experts in. So it's a lot about this question of intuitive expertise. Then other people are Donald Hoffman. He has written this book, The Case Against Reality, where like his subtitle is something like why evolution hid the truth from us. But I think it's the other way around, right? Like why evolution has generated an interface to deal with reality. It's not hiding truth. It's about creating an
Yeah, just
interface.
on that front, I found that interesting, and he's another one who's sort of on my radar, exploring same themes, but seems to come to very different conclusions
Yeah,
around all this. And so I find that interesting as well, that you can kind
yeah,
of explore this, but then get to, in a sense, the inverse conclusion that I would come to, which is all this to me. Well, this is one of those philosophical things that came to mind earlier that I feel like all this is really getting at as well, which is the metaphysics or even the ontology here, right? Of like, do we live in a kind of realist frame where there is a world out there, so to speak? I mean, it seems to me like all of these models have to presume something like that.
yeah.
There's an agent in an arena, there's something, and it's in a context. And so when this starts getting into this kind of radical anti-realist, no, it's just the mind, there's nothing for the mind to bump up
No.
against at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah,
And
no.
then anyway, so it's interesting though that he is someone on that list of sort of exploring these topics, but comes to different radical conclusions
Yes,
about them.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yes. Well, there's tons of other people. I think exactly I've mentioned David Tuckett and Samuel Johnson, like the narrative economics. Then Vernon Smith, he wrote also about ecological rationality, but he stressed very different things. So he got actually the Nobel Prize together with Daniel Kahneman in 2002. But I think Daniel Kahneman became very famous, while Vernon Smith is not very heard of. And he really stresses the importance of institutions as a way to deal with like building good institutions that like basically do the information processing for us. Well, he makes many more points, so does everyone here, right? So I can't summarize all points that everyone is making. And then Melanie Mitchell, she's also at the Santa Fe Institute. She also works at the problem of meaning in AI. Yeah, so many more. But like, right, I think exactly, I really tried to be this bridge as well, because I've just read so broadly to come to these conclusions. So just hope to bring some people to you don't know, but you know most of the people. I mean, right. My experience reading the book was always, I was like, yeah, I would definitely mention this person here. And then you already mentioned them,
Okay,
right?
good.
Because
Well,
so they're the most important people for sure.
awesome. I'm glad there aren't any glaring omissions, but no, that is all super helpful. And I'm gonna follow this thread, and there's so much there. So we'll talk after this, because I'd love to get some specific maybe articles or books from some of these folks, and try to integrate all of that. And then just one last thing, just for me, because I don't want to. So on that Jake, was it Jake Ortwright you mentioned?
Ortwine.
Ortwine, but he's an older guy, you said.
No. Brian Cantwell Smith is older, but
Oh,
Jake is like our age.
yeah.
And
Is he?
he
Does he
actually has this
bald?
podcast. Yes.
Yes, I think I have met him. This is why I just wanted to make sure that I
Yeah.
because he might have actually come to Sky Meadow, and we,
Yes.
if it's the same person I'm thinking of, we had a great conversation. There was a lot of overlap, and so I just wouldn't
Yeah.
want to leave the impression out there like, so sorry, Jake. No, I think we have indeed met, and yeah, a lot of connection there. Cool. All right, I'm glad
Yeah.
I
I think he had this podcast called Frame Problems, right? So
Oh,
it's
yeah, well, yeah,
very,
that's very, yeah,
yeah.
very fitting. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. That's incredible. And clearly, it also just reveals, I mean, you've been in this field and deeply researching this stuff for some time. Your paper that you did, the preprint that I was looking at with that you did with Vervaeke, I mean, it's a wonderful resource in itself, because you're citing, this stuff, and it's a very people who kind of maybe only are familiar with this stuff through more popular presentations, should check that out, because there's it's a full-on scholarly, properly cited treatment, where you're kind of dealing with each of these things in turn. So I'll also probably put a link to that in this description. So anyway, well, thank you very much. And this will be continuing to be something that I want to keep learning about. I mean, the whole book is about learning. And so, we're all learning about learning, which is the funny kind of meta thing here as well.
Yeah.
So I'm as this book series is coming out, I want to continue to update it and integrate things that weren't included in earlier editions and stuff. So thanks for that. That's very helpful. And then I think this does, unless there's anything else on that front that you want to touch on, I would love to spend the last part of this, talking about your work in all this, and the things that are kind of the leading edge for you, and what you're trying to contribute to some of this, which, as I understand, relates to ethics and other things there. So yeah, let's maybe dive into that segment of things, and feel free to set that up however you'd like to.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
again,
I mean,
another big, there you go.
no. I mean, I have an angle here. But first you asked like, what else would I want to say? So I think I
Yeah,
would love to actually do another talk sometime, because I feel like now we just like scratched the
yeah,
surface
yeah.
of everything. Like, oh my God, just like mention this, but not drilling into anything in a sense. So there's so much more one could say. But yeah, coming to the next topic that I suggested to talk about. So, well, I read your book, right? And it very strongly builds on this idea of dissipative structures, like living organisms that have to self-organize and maintain their structure against this constant stress of falling into like entropy and just basically dying, if you talk about it as a a living system. And there's also this normativity in it, right? That a lot of what the organism ought to do, in a sense, stems from its living nature.
Hmm.
And I very reluctantly talk about the whole topic of ethics, because that's definitely not where I come from. But because I have been very, very engaged with the whole effective altruism community and literature, I feel like, in a sense, I feel like there is some importance there of translating one understanding to the other part of like what, right? Like, what do you have to do, or what do you have to do to have the best, to do the most good, which is the effective altruism question, right? And yeah.
Well, and again,
anything?
when we first
Yeah.
were talking about this, you come from that background of rationality and trying to
Yeah.
think of things in terms of, yeah, navigating this world of uncertainty, what's sort of the best, most rational, most effective thing that we can do. And so in terms of how that connects up with sort of the, effective altruism movement and the kind of presumptions of ideas in that framework, it sounds like as you've explored deeper into the cognitive science and gotten into all these things we've been talking about,
Yeah.
it's sort of like, actually, there's a different way of seeing that, which is how I'm understanding your approach to this.
Yes. And so I think you also make some statements about, right, like the sacred as basically a culturally evolved, maybe a hard rule of what we value to get other positive consequences from valuing it, right? It's basically baked in, hard coded into the cultural fabric. So we don't, right, it makes it certain errors that we might do otherwise or might commit otherwise. Um, I think I'm just gonna dig in a bit into
Yeah,
what I actually want to say here. So
yeah.
well, the title I'm reluctantly suggesting for basically my theory of how to apply this to ethics is autopoethics, right? Autopoiesis, living self-organizing systems on one hand, and ethics, the principles of right conduct to do the most good. And first of all, like, what is autopoiesis? I think that's very interesting because originally the question was like, what is life by Schrödinger, which basically said, right, like, oh, the systems need energy and then they do stuff with it and also they reproduce. But Varela and Maturana proposed the idea of autopoiesis instead, where they said the most, right, like you are alive even if you don't reproduce. And what makes reproduction so interesting is because you are organized in a certain way and you create another being that's also then organized in that way, but the organizational structure is what makes something be alive, namely that it self maintains its own organization over time and against
Mhm.
entropy, right? So that this was a huge important like step in how we understand what even does it mean to be alive. And well, there's a lot of normativity that stems out of it, right? You have to do certain things to maintain the structure because otherwise you die. And a lot of what we value because, as you say, right, like what is meaningful to us is because it basically helps us to stay alive. Or maybe you want to rephrase that in your own words.
No, I would just say, yeah, basically resist entropy, which allows
Yeah,
that to go even deeper than just living systems. But yeah, and then at the level of living systems, that means staying alive. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, so right, so and then when we talk about normativity here, then I come from this other framework that I used to think about doing good. And I'm quickly going to lay out what effective altruism is about. How much do you know about effective altruism?
Not as much as I should, but that's a broad category of things. For me, my understanding is something like it's a kind of movement in philanthropic thought and sort of a paradigm of ethical thinking that tries to maximize sort of positive effect, but particularly by considering like a like kind of deep time or like a very large time scale, so that there's a sense in which, well, what I do today impacts the 10 billion people however many generations from now, so I've got to like rationally think about that level of impact. That's mostly what I know about it, that I would
Yeah,
think of that makes it kind of unique, because it's thinking about impact at that level of scale, and through a kind of cascade
yeah.
effect into the future. Yeah.
So the cascade effect into the future is actually a particular branch of
Mm.
EA thinking, namely long-termism, and it's actually a very recent idea. But effective altruism is way older than
Mm.
that. But the main idea of effective altruism is, well, how do we do the most good? Right. First, the question, like the inquiry itself, how do we do the most good? And then secondly, let's do it. And it claims to apply rational thinking and decision making and scientific thinking to the question of how to have the most impact. So it has general, because of that, it has a very consequentialist and utilitarian outlook on it, and what signifies the most positive impact is the idea of, well, increasing overall well-being of sentient creatures or reducing suffering. So overall, this like welfareism perspective, like reluctantly. So historically, they have been very influenced by ideas like, well, Kahneman and Tversky and the whole behavioral economics, right? We're not as rational as we should be, or as we could be. Then research by people like Esther Duflo, who's written this book like Poor Economics into evidence-based development aid, right? That we can understand it and we can do it better by understanding, well, what works, what is evidence-based. And then ethical advancements by people like Peter Singer or Derek Parfit, who, like Peter Singer in particular, claimed this notion of the expanding moral circle, right? That we are too biased to what is close to us, but actually we ought to help people that are far away from us, in particular because we're very affluent, and it's very cheap to help people that are very, very far away. And the example the thought experiment is often just like child in the pond, right? If a child is drowning in front of me and my only cost to save it is that I destroy the suit I'm wearing, there's very little cost and I should be doing it. And now the question is, well, should I also do it if the child was drowning on the other side of the globe? And his argument is, yes, we ought to, right? Because why does it matter that there's just some geographical distance? So the moral circle, first of all, before it extended into the future, it just expanded globally in like this global perspective, and then also across species line. So this anti-speciesism, this question of which beings have sentience, right? Which beings have the ability to suffer, and then right, basically considering who are all the entities that would need our help in a sense. And then the main principles that are applied, or the framework, is again just like maximizing expected utility or expected value. And the principles are looking at, well, which problems are really, really large, right? Are there problems that affect many people that are nevertheless very tractable? So a huge part of this huge problem could be solved, and that they're also neglected. So it's this marginal utility question. So the question of from our limited resources, where could additional resources make a big difference, basically? And then you have arguments like there's lots of very common diseases that are extremely cheap to solve, right? So for example, schistosomiasis is a parasitic worm infection, and it costs around, and I think around 200 million people have it at any moment. And to treat it per person costs like 50 cents, right? It's per year, right? So it's extremely cheap. And then the argument is, of course, well, how can you justify buying whatever consumer good that you don't actually need if you could otherwise save people that are far away? Okay, so far, kind of this impartial welfarist framework.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, well, so one, that was really helpful because I guess I've been conflating too much long-termism with a broader kind of effective altruism thing. And it's interesting for you to kind of to hear you lay out the broad tenets, because on the surface of it, I mean, that sounds pretty good, right? There's a lot of logic to that way of thinking. And I would also presume that philanthropists like Bill Gates are probably presuming some framework like this when, they try to, for example, do various kinds of disease eradication and, polio vaccination things at different parts of the world. So I'm assuming that that's kind of the thought here is like kind of maximal leverage to increase the well-being in a sense the most cost-effective way through a kind of utilitarian perspective. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God. And now I hope we have enough time to actually dig into my arguments of how this could be wrong.
Yeah.
One thing it assumes is the question of neglectedness, right? So some things are important and they're tractable and they're cost effective to do, but they're very, very neglected. But to ask yourself what is neglected, you usually have to assume a certain ground of something that's just there. And what is assumed there is, well, we are rich, right? Our civilization will just continue to grow. There will be progress. We will all be well off. So we have these extra resources that we can now give quite far away because there's people suffering and having a lot of problems, and it's very cheap to solve. So I would make the argument that what you completely ignore is, of course, that we stand on this self-organizing system, right? And now you want to give resources very far outside of it. So one claim you could make is that you're actually increasing the entropy with that, right? That in a sense, of course, because a system needs a lot of energy to maintain itself, doing things inside of the logic of the system is quite expensive, right? And now I could, of course, give it somewhere else where stuff is not working, where people are not standing on this huge, very, very complex system. And therefore, well, it's in a sense very, very cheap to make a difference there. But it has a different logic in a sense. So, for example, one argument, I think it's not made so much anymore, but in the beginning was, well, if you train, for example, a guide dog for a blind person, that costs around, I think back then the number was around $40,000. So it's extremely expensive, right? So if you contrast this with, let's say you just want to help blind people, and this is the problem you want to solve, but there's many other people that just need a very cheap cataract surgery, which is maybe, I think, estimates around $300 per person, right, in developing countries where many people don't have normal access to those things. So now, how can you justify getting someone a guide dog, really, really complex and expensive to do, versus helping other people to get these surgeries? And like, I completely understand this compassionate framework. Of course, you want to help more people, right? If everyone is worth the same, which is one very important assumption, then you would argue, well, of course, you should give it over there. But I think there's this, I mean, there's an argument I'm making now, but there is this asymmetry, of course, that the ground has to be continuously graded, which needs a lot of energy, and we depend on it surviving in a sense. And of course, I would assume that the energy currency inside the system is way, way higher. So I'm not so sure this trade-off can be calculated like that. So maybe you can just say what this sounds to you like.
Yeah, no, well, it's really interesting. Well, I mean, because one, yeah, I think when we briefly talked about this in another conversation, the idea that came to mind, or the metaphor, was like if you're on a plane and there's a problem, and the oxygen masks come down, they say, while our normal inclination might be like, if we're a parent, to try to help out our child, if the individual themselves isn't kind of going to put the mask on themselves, then they're not going to be able to do that good. So there does need to be basically the maintenance of that organism for it to be able to do other things. So one of the things that comes out of what I'm hearing you say is this notion of like, there does need to be attention, some tending to the kind of self-organizing system that is the one that would be the pool of the resources that's looking elsewhere to deploy those resources. So that's a very logical argument. One of the things that does come up for me, though, is sort of like, kind of like a deeper philosophical or meta-ethical question or something, is like, something like, one way of talking about it would be, as you do expand the scope of sort of moral concern, then you do start to see that in a sense there aren't multiple systems, that it's all kind of one system. And so there is a sense of like, well, helping these groups over here is not as much of an externalization of energy and resources as much as it is a kind of almost collective negentropic move, you could say. So that would be a potential, not counter, but just a challenge, or something that comes up in terms of like a pushback, or something that someone could say, well, you could still use the same general framework that you're using, but interpret it slightly differently. And then the other element is much more social and kind of cultural responses, right? Like this can be really fraught territory to get into philosophically, right? Because people have a lot of feelings about what goes into altruistic and philanthropic kinds of activities. And so, in some senses, what you're getting at is like, it's kind of a sacred cow that people might feel like, oh no, you're in danger territory here if you try to get people to rethink their presumptions around this. So I think in order to do that successfully, there wouldn't just have to be satisfactory critiques of effective altruism. There'd also have to be an alternative theory or approach that would suggest that it could do, in a sense, what effective altruism is trying to do, but better, right? It could make a better world more effectively. So then I feel like you'd have to go into a set of like, here's how I see things should be operating, and this is why it would be better. Sorry, those are just a few thoughts that come up.
Yeah. So first of all, like 3 more disclaimers around this in general. So, but I'm not committed to this other, like
Mm.
to autopoetics, whatever it is, I want to bring it forth as a perspective to then dialectically find better answers, which is completely in alignment even with the EA question of how to do the most good. I just feel like there's a lot of information in this whole framework that has not been properly integrated yet.
Well,
Um,
and just to that point though, because I totally agree with that as well. And I also I want to add that last part into what I just said because I think that kind of classic utilitarian approaches to these issues is way too simplistic and it isn't properly taking in enough information about the whole system. So I think we need some serious updates to how we're thinking about altruism and effective, pro-social activity. And yes, we need to be integrating that with our understanding of autopoietic systems, complex systems, that level of analysis. So I think your
yeah,
entire project is like, yes, we need to do this. I was just also trying to outline some people's initial
yeah,
gut reactions maybe to these sorts of things. But anyway, sorry, I did
yeah,
interrupt. Go on.
exactly. So that's the first like disclaimer. The second is, so lots of people have taken very cheap shots against EA recently or in the last years, especially after FTX. There's a lot of very valid criticism, but I also find a lot of the cheap shots very tasteless, and that's not what I want to do at all. And then the third thing I want to say is, even if we would, for example, reformulate foundational conceptions, it doesn't mean that concrete actions that came out as answers could not also still hold, right? Many of the recommendations, even if there was a new conceptual foundation, could still be the right thing to do. So, for example, okay, so one of the things I would like, that now going back to what I actually want to say is, so EA has also, in a sense, I would say, this view from nowhere, right? There is this objective view from the universe of what matters. Everyone matters. Every sentient being matters. If you prioritize yourself, in a sense, you're biased, overstating it a bit, right? And I would say this does not hold from both our
Mm.
philosophy of science. It doesn't hold from a complexity and meaning perspective. And I think it's very important to very clearly reestablish the individual at the center of ethics, both to create this like integrity of information, and then also because there is, right, I have way more information about myself and what I need. I'm way more in a position to help myself than anyone else. And the further I expand who I care about, the more I would say information is actually deteriorating. So it should fundamentally be grounded in my self-interest. And then because I have to, right, continue to exist for right, even if I assume I'm good, if I want to be ethical, then I have to assume I deserve to to live. Therefore, my self-interest always go first, and that's then I can have these negotiations. And I think there's also arguments that by those tensions between different interests, this is actually how systems actually complexify, right? So I think this is very valid to just say it's completely okay to have first-person perspective, but of course integrate the needs of others, right? Because there's exactly this interaction by which new information and, for example, institutions actually emerge. And if we establish this, right, okay, everything is foundational, like it starts from the center out, right? From the extended circle definitely still needs to have the center, even though I can care about others, then other global causes can still matter, right? So if I say, okay, I take care about myself first, then I take care of for my extended environment, which could, for example, be, doesn't have to be my country, but let's say my country, right? Then even then I could say causes that are global are extremely important for my self-interest. So for example, one cause is lead exposure eradication. And I think the claim is that lead exposure in the environment can basically like massively decrease IQ, lead to cognitive disabilities, and massively increase criminality and violence. So I think it's completely in my self-interest to have less potentially very violent people in the world, because right, every person that's very violent exists could potentially come to my country and pose additional risks, of course, right? So I think it's very much grounded, even if in my self-maintenance, to, for example, care about causes like that.
Yes, 100%. And this, oh gosh, there's so much that this all brings up.
I know.
Yeah, no, it's great. So just a few thoughts on that. So on that last point first, I think that's entirely right. And I think that that's the way that we really need to reformulate our collective ethical thought is that, the way I always talk about this when I describe the whole project that I'm working on is that this meaning making and these values that people have, that that occurs, yes, at sort of the individual level for a lot of earlier parts of sort of biological evolution. But when you get into the cultural sphere and you have minds that are networked with each other and we're sharing ideas and we're sharing our internal worlds and this sort of a thing, then my valuations are synced up and related to your valuations in a way that doesn't exist in other parts of the complexity stack. And I think that we can really get a better understanding of human ethics and morality when we appreciate that it's actually it's not that this, there's the presumption so much coming from this history or this lineage of sort of I don't know, kind of 19th century Western liberal Enlightenment thought that we're all just atomized individuals and like we can choose to be altruistic or something, but like ultimately the base unit is some like isolated, atomized individual. And that's not quite right. Like I am an individual because I live in a society. And this goes back to that Mead that I was talking about earlier and other thinkers, right? That like the socialization process is so essential to create the individual. And so when an individual realizes that, then they can actually begin to understand that what they are as an individual encompasses the concerns of others. So that's just a growing out of the tree rings of concern, but in a way that comes to realize that, the ethical considerations in altruistic activities, that's a logical and rational outgrowth of one's own self-concern and regard. So I just want to say all that real quick. But everything you're saying is really interesting because it touches on so many aspects. And I want to give you the main spotlight here, but just in bringing up these things, I want to also throw by a couple of thoughts of how this might relate to some other things. Like one thought that occurs to me is we live in complex systems, societies are complex systems. And one thing that we've seen through well-intentioned philanthropic altruistic activity is sometimes that people break complex systems over here in the intent to do good. Like, for example, if you go into an economically depressed area and you say, oh, these folks don't have X, right? And then you just flood that area with, cheap X,
Yeah.
then you destroy the local economy, and then actually you've created a bigger problem, systemic problem than, and so those are the kinds of concerns that if we're outwardly focused and we're too we're not kind of thinking about it from a ground up sort of internal coherence complexification process, then we're liable to, in a sense, export problems rather than actually export solutions. And that goes also geopolitically as well. I mean, if you look at what happened with the Iraq War, I would argue there was a similar notion of like, oh, we'll just bring democracy over here, right? Rather than allow that, social complexification process to undergo its own sort of organic, autopoetic unfolding. And you create a lot of problems when you try to impose those kinds of systems. So it's just interesting that even when people try to do well, they can cause a lot of harm if they're not properly oriented. And I think that what you're getting at is a helpful way of understanding why that's the case and what would also then be, better approaches to this.
Yeah, I have to jump in there and say I think overall, right, exactly understanding that many do good, like attempts at doing good don't work. That's exactly why effective altruism came into existence. And there's this huge EA literature on exactly like failed projects. There's even on the 80,000 hours website, I think there's even a quiz you can take where there's different projects, and then you have to guess whether it had a positive impact or a negative impact. And it often sounds very convincing, and then you read why it didn't work, and it's very surprising, right? So our intuitions are very flawed, which is exactly the original proposition. We're very biased, both in like who we care and don't care about, but also in what we think works and doesn't work. So lots of need for enhanced wisdom there.
Well, and I
But
just have one thought I wanted to throw by you too. One thing that this is also making me think about is I saw recently some studies that they've done. I forget who did the study, but they looked at different ways of people thinking about those expanding levels of concern relative
yeah,
to conservative and sort of liberal ideological orientations. And the conservative orientation is very kind of from the center out, but it's more like
yeah,
like self, family, this.
yeah.
Whereas the liberal orientation is like begins from the out and kind of moves in. So like,
Mm,
and in that sense, there's a suggestion that like certain ideological orientations to altruism will, like some folks will just think of, let's go, try to help the people furthest away, furthest on sort of
yeah,
the margins, and then think about sort of ourselves last. What's interesting about that though, is that arguably, I think you could make the case that some of what we're seeing happening geopolitically, and in the United States domestic policy, for example, is a lot of reaction to certain failed attempts to be expansive in that way. And so there's a kind of political
100%.
contraction going on right now that we're seeing across the world, really,
Yeah.
where a lot of well-intentioned, more liberal thought, because it was sort of oriented outward in, has caused the inward, the center, to kind of like, react against what they're feeling as an unfair,
Yeah.
allocation of resources, et cetera. And so the net result that we're experiencing and have been over the past 10, 15, 20 years is a kind of global contraction that arguably is hurting everyone. So it's also an interesting thing that you can think about, where if we even in our best intentions to try to attend to those on the periphery and the margins first, we might actually be doing even those folks more harm because of the reactions that come about
Yeah.
from the center out, if that makes sense. So those are just some thoughts that
Yes.
came up while you were talking.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I can add,
Yeah.
but many of those you might probably have heard. But so, for example, Daniel Schmachtenberger has this very nice introduction video where he explains perspectival approach to reality, right? And how basically different political, well, frameworks make claims about different important parts of reality. So the left or liberal, progressive ideas, right? There's people that are not very well off, and we can help them, and we have the resources to do so. And then the right is more like, well, self-responsibility, reward those people that do a lot of work to generate resources in the first place.
Right.
You have to reward those people that work really hard and are really capable, and right, let them move upwards. Otherwise, they will stop creating the resources that we can then give away. And he says, right, it's not, if you think in one line or just like one dimension, then you would say, oh, they're completely contradicting. But of course, if you have perspective, you say, no, it's both, right? We want to have the space where we have the ability to generate resources, and then we also have a safety net where people get helped if they really need to. But you cannot, right, either perspective alone neglects important parts about reality. And I think that even just this understanding of perspectival realism here, really, I think this could resolve so many political conflicts by just understanding, right? Like multiple things can be true, and they don't necessarily have to directly contradict, but there's a space where both hold, and we understand both, and we understand inherent trade-offs between different perspectives and integrate it, right? Exactly, this complexification through integration. Then you made the point of exactly like recently, right? We had this extreme expansion. So I come from Germany, and I think in Germany you had this very strong sense of we're doing so well economically. We can, right, like we can do insane climate actions because we're doing so well, and we do those things at our own cost because, well, we know we're doing well, and then other people will probably follow us, and we can also take every refugee in. And this is, of course, exactly the same assumption of well, there's a stable system that you stand on that's gonna go well continuously, which is just an assumption that just is not true, right? If you overextend this framework, then you will undermine the foundation you're actually standing on. And this is exactly what we also see, that people are starting to get really, really angry because they feel very much neglected because they are no longer actually represented in what is being thought of, right? If you no longer can probably afford heating and food, it's of course very well, you will feel very left out if the politicians only talk about well, transsexuals and climate change, which is often really what you hear, right? So it's all very, very understandable, but it's the same with EA, right? It assumes everything is going well, and those far away things are neglected. But I would also say, right, if you overemphasize this, which EA, it understands that it is a marginal framework, right? But if you overemphasize this way of thinking, you will, of course, you will eat on the ground you're standing on, and you can again bring this idea in from Buddhism, this idea of groundlessness, right? All your assumptions, they're not true, but they change over time. And there was a specific historical context in which you could act that way, but I would argue it has changed a bit in recent years, and also would say it's a completely historical outlier, of course, to say, oh, there's so many resources, that has never happened before, right? That's not the default position. The default position is that there's constant risk of disorder and things deteriorating if you don't keep them up, right? Which is the same state that a living system has. And then to expand even further, so what you said, right, this liberal approach versus the more conservative one, Jonathan Haidt has written about this moral foundation theory, where there's different moral foundations of what you can care about, and everyone cares a bit about all of those, but different, well, like people are differently politically oriented, prioritize different ones, and the more liberal one is very care harm, which is of course, right, like if you care about reducing suffering, then you're basically an extreme version of a progressive. Even if EA claims to not be political, it is very, very strongly tainted by a specific moral foundation here. Versus the conservative ones, they follow a lot of the, I would say, like the social order processes of caring about authority, right? Like if someone is more established, you take them more seriously, but also what are the other ones? Actually, loyalty, right? That you prioritize some people over others because they have already done something for you specifically. So you are in a specific relationship with them that is different from other people, which I would argue is very in alignment with living systems where you need differentiation, right? You cannot just treat everyone the same because you have actually this coupling and this relational where, of course, your history of interaction should like have an influence on how you then treat people, because then you have a different structure where you can also have different norms of interactions that enable new options and so forth. So anyway, so conservatives prioritize the local way more, like the self, the family, then local loyalties, and way more the sense of order, right? Versus the other, the more liberal care harm principles. Sanctity is also very conservative. Okay, one point I want to make before you jump in. Okay, so one point that I actually saw John Marecki make together with Adam, I forgot his last name, at I think a H21, like some kind of institution in Prague where they discussed about political, political thinking. And they made the case that, of course, right, like we have the idea of relevance realization where you take the context in, you narrow in, and you have this oppositional processing of different lenses, right? Different perspectives. And they argue that basically the political system, you could understand it as exactly this opponent processing of different perspectives. And that's exactly right. Like one framework clearly failed in important ways, and now you can see the other one become very, very stronger. So I think that that is one way to make sense out of this as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that too, or at least in theory, because I think one thing that we've also seen over the past 10 years is that those the polarization of those opponent processes has increased. And so at a certain point, like you can have a dynamic kind of equilibrium that gets established if there's enough tension, but not too much. But at a certain point, the question is, does that actually destabilize the whole thing? And I was just going to ask earlier, because as you say, like the more conservative approach is to focus more in kind of the center and out in the kind of local and immediate, that sort of thing. With what you're talking about in this Autopoethics framework, I could hear people say, oh, well, then maybe that leans conservative because what you're talking about is sort of orienting from. Would you say that that's the case, or would you say that what this Autopoethics frame that you're using is kind of precisely kind of multi-perspectival that you were talking about earlier, that it's incorporating both aspects of the left and the right orientations to the good?
So I think this difference between what I want, right, the effect I want to have versus the process is very important. So I think having the axiom of enlightened self-interest that integrates others' needs into it at the center is very important, because otherwise you lose a lot of information, right? Because information is local and relational. And from this, it also follows that I treat people differently. So I actually, right, I can still say their intrinsic moral worth is the same, but I can still, for example, like to associate with people that are similar to me, right? Because it will also create an environment where we actually have a better fittedness to one another and can accomplish certain things better, right? So I think the process is very like it has to be somewhat separate from the thing I want to do. And the theory behind this is, so for example, in cognitive science, there's the 3-level hypothesis of cognitive systems by David Marr, where you have the computational level, right? The function or what you want to accomplish, right? Like maximizing expected utility, for example, or solving a specific problem. But then under the computational level, you have the algorithm problem. And the algorithm is, but the process by which you do it is not the same as right? There's not some homunculus sitting inside that thing calculating, but there's actually a kind of an algorithm that does a certain process to achieve it. And there is you have to think of those separately. And then underneath is, of course, the physical implementation. And someone who makes a similar argument is John Kay, who has written a book called Obliquity. And he makes the argument that the same way, basically, that a lot of goods in the world are achieved very indirectly. So, for example, if you want to invest into a company, of course, you want the company to make a lot of money, right? So you want them to maximize profit. But the best way to find the company that will maximize profit is probably not the ones that have the best business plan, that has great calculations of how they will maximize the profit, but you probably have other heuristics, like, for example, a founder that clearly knows what he's doing, very much cares, for example, about the user experience or their product, is very good at doing this, right? So the profit maximizing is not best approached through the process of calculating how to maximize profit, but by a different process, so by indirect means. And I think the same, I would argue, is true in maximizing welfare, where me directly giving my money to people is usually not the best way to actually increase welfare, but actually very indirectly. So exactly was what you argue about complexification, right? So I think everyone self-actualizing to the fullest is very overall coupled to the overall welfare increase also of others, right? Because if I fully introspect, figure out what I have to offer the world, then maybe even spend some resources that I have on becoming even better at that, and then offering this, I will overall offer way more to the world than, for example, keeping myself maybe smaller, not complexifying myself to the fullest or developing myself to the fullest and directly giving this away. Because overall, I think there's a huge coupling of basically movement in welfare higher up to overall our ability to affect that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, gosh. Yeah. So this is such a rich topic. Maybe we can also have another topic or podcast.
I
just
don't
on
want
this.
to keep you longer than you want to.
No, I just I also try to think about we've covered so much ground already. I'm thinking about the general audience member and want to make sure that we're not overloading them with all this. But there's so much to this, and it's such a rich topic or project even to apply these ways of thinking to maximizing human welfare, right? I mean, then ultimately, what are we all doing if that's not deeply kind of our goal? Just real quick, that last thing you were saying was interesting because keeping in mind, in a sense, the system as a whole to produce maximal good rather than, in a sense, always just at the most immediate level trying to maximize good is an insight probably from general effective altruism itself, but when thought about in terms of complex self-organizing systems, it takes on a different flavor. And so I don't know, there's so many thoughts I had to that, but actually I probably don't have enough time to get into them. So maybe we should just designate a round two for some of this stuff, because I think it's really important. Okay, yeah. So with that in mind, that we'll do that. What would you say, if there's anything else around this general framework that you're kind of laying out, anything else you'd like to put out there to give people in this presentation of this kind of, everything that they need to get not everything, but a lot of what they need to get the contours of what it is that you're describing. You feel like you've already done that? Is there anything else around this autopoethics approach that you feel like would be important to outline?
So when I started out with understanding in activism, right, you get the semiotic lens on approaching the truth and the chaotic nature of reality. What I did not so much immediately understand is that it's not just this inside that we make meaning inside of our head, but also that we also extend this meaning into our environment. Right? So culture is this kind of an extended interface to the chaotic nature that we bring forth, not because to basically the other way around, make the world more intelligible to us. So basically to fit the world to us the other way around. So our sense making is not just in our head, but it extends into how we construct our artificial world that we're creating to make sense out of the world, which I'm also saying to connect it back to what I've just said about applying it to ethics, this idea that, well, if this is so important for us to operate in the world, to have this meaningful interface, then I think we have a lot of responsibility to keep it intact. And as I've also said before about, for example, old resources that are easily forgotten, right? So the default is always the next generation knows none of those ideas. We have to keep certain information flows alive to guarantee that the level we are at collectively is maintained, right? So for me, it becomes very hard to then make trade-off calculations like, should I help certain persons very far away, or right, like, should I become an educator to maintain certain information? Of course, you can always assume this is the normal stuff and people are doing it anyway. But I think applying this autopoietic lens to those questions really, really helps to understand how indirect a lot of the value creation really is. Yeah, I think
that's great, and actually that helps me more effectively summarize what I wanted to say a second ago, which I felt like would be too difficult. But what I was thinking is basically this: that what I think also need to be considering when we're trying to maximize human flourishing and welfare is to we need the requisite complexity in our system to achieve more optimal levels of collective well-being. And if we are, in a sense, siphoning away resources to try to attend to particular problems in particular areas because we think that that's the most effective way, we also have to cognize that that siphoning away of resources then isn't, for example, going into maintaining the complexity of, say, like institutional academic contexts or training or education contexts that are, for example, the sorts of places where you're producing future leaders and learners and members of society who then can continue to do that. So that kind of reallocation of resources outside the system. So in a sense, if you were to imagine society as something like this organism or a cell that's moving around resources, there are particular kind of organelles in that cell that are in themselves their kind of own complex adaptive autopoietic systems that are in relation to what's outside of them but are also separate from them. There's kind of a Markov blanket there. And so optimally, that organelle isn't just going to say, hey, the best thing we can do is just like, take all of the energy flowing through us and just put it out here because it'll explode. So it needs to find not even just how would you say? I guess, the optimal relationship to self-maintenance and attending to what is needed outside of its Markov blanket, but with it being in mind that it's that relationship that's actually what they're trying to maintain, right? So it's like it's not even just self-organization, it's self-organization relative to this other thing that it also is trying to help complexify. And that if it isn't self-organizing with the adequate resources to attend to that, then it's not adequately self-organizing. And so there's something very complex there that I'm trying to explain and not doing a very good job. But I'm just trying to connect with what you're talking about here in trying to get us to think about these things differently from an autopoietic standpoint that actually takes into consideration the relative complexification of sort of the organelle itself relative to the good it's trying to do outside of the organelle itself, because that is also bearing upon its viability in some other way as well. So I'll try to maybe find a better way of expressing that. I don't know if that landed or made sense.
I'm gonna rewatch it myself to make sure I understood this because I'm not sure I did.
Yeah. All right, I'll try it again some other time. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that this is great about because it gets you to the edge of your thought, and so sometimes that's where you struggle the most to like, I can see it, but I can't necessarily express it. So yeah, let's do a take two of this, or like round
100%.
two, I should say, because this is so interesting.
It's also actually, this conversation is also self-referential, right? Because I'm saying like, oh, what if a self-organizing system like overextends itself, that like its own organization is eaten up, and we try to cover so much that maybe the individual parts lack the order they would need.
Right.
So in that sense, it's self-referential.
Yeah, we might want to take a apply the very medicine that you're talking about and attend to the coherence internally first before so I guess we'll just leave it there for now. I will say, oh, one last thing I did want to mention relative to this is, I'm involved in the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, IAM, and Josh Leonard is doing some really interesting work exploring the evolution of philanthropy.
No,
And I think that, yeah, I'd love to put you two in touch maybe because a lot of what you're talking about is exactly what I think he's kind of interested in, is applying systems thought and complexity thinking to the very evolutionary stages that philanthropy itself has progressed through. And I feel like you're articulating the cusp of a new wave of thinking about how to do philanthropy. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, and maybe we can make that connection and see if something fruitful could come from that. But for now, thank you so much, Anna. This was really fantastic, and I've learned so much from you. I'm going to continue to try to digest the bibliographic information that you'll share with me and try to integrate that into what I'm doing. And I'm really excited to have you, working with Sky Meadow Institute going forward, and
me
we'll
too.
figure out some really cool things to do there. So, all right, until next time, thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you as well, and well, looking forward.
Take care.